Hello, my name's Andres Gallegos.
Hello, my name is Jefferson Walang. Welcome to our video activity number 5 about the summary of the book The Boy from Yesterday.
The author's name is John Davidge. John Davidge writes other fiction and non-fiction and has adapted many books for students learning English as a foreign language. He lives near the sea in Dorset in the South England. This history was developed in Plymouth, a small town located in South Boston around 200. As main characters, we have Patty, Will, and her mother, Mrs. Dale. Patty is a tall girl of about 165 meters and thin. Her hair is brown and she is 22 years old. Will is a boy who is 19 years old. He is tall and a little fat. Mrs. Dale has blonde hair. She is tall and a little thin.
This story is about Mrs. Dale and her children, Patty and Will. First, they arrive to the cottage and meet Mrs. Barnes. Mrs. Barnes works for Mr. Whip. Up at the big house, she is a big woman with red smiling face. This cottage is near the sea and is not too far from the center of the village. In the big house, Mr. Webb lived with his grandson Roger. He is 15, like Patty and Will. Later, they take their things out the car and they go into the cottage. And the rooms are small and dark, but everything is clean. Later, Mrs. Dale put her small computer on the window because she is a writer. Later, Will go into his bedroom and he can see the sea, and Patty see the cliffs and the great sea. When they look down, they see their mother with Mrs. Barnes in the garden holding a secret, and they go down the stairs and their mother come into the cottage and she doesn't say anything.
Chapter 2. A telephone calls. Patty and Will got out to the beach and along the cliffs, but it was raining, so they came back to the cottage because they got very wet and cold. Patty and Will went into the kitchen. Will started to cook and Patty watched him. Suddenly the telephone rang. Mrs. Dale answered it. Then Mrs. Dale ran into the kitchen. Her father had called to say her that her mother was ill. She was in hospital, and Mrs. Dale had to went back home that night. Late at night, her mother phoned from hospital. She said them that grandmother was okay. At 5 o'clock the next morning, Will sat up in bed. He listened a noise. He couldn't come back bed. He went to the kitchen, for a cup of coffee. Then he heard another noise. He thought it was a cellar door, or perhaps it was the rain or the wind, but knew that it wasn't.
At 6 o'clock, Patty see across the garden and she see a figure move between the trees. Patty looks the boy. The boy wears black trousers, gray shirt, and heavy shoes. But Patty can't look his face. But when Patty see the boy again, the boy isn't there. Breakfast, Patty and Will talk about the future than Patty see. Then Patty and Will hear noise under the cottage, and they look at cellar door for 10 minutes. And they look at cellar door for 10 minutes. An hour later, Mrs. Dale calls Patty and says Granddad is well, and Mrs. Dale asks about the cottage, and Patty says the cottage is right. When they walk through big pools, and they see the water is nearly the road. When Will see around him, he looks a figure in the trees, but he doesn't know why.
Chapter 4. The Picture. Patty and Will go to the village shop. They got something to eat and other things. They come out. The road is like a river of rainwater. They went another shop. There were a lot of old books and a lot of postcards and picture of the village in the window. Then they saw a small picture of the Seabird house. That house was called the smuggler's house because George Fenton, the smuggler, lived there. The wind was much stronger. They were walked and they saw that the stream was much bigger. Some of the road started to breaking. Suddenly, Patty heard Will shout, "Ah!" She saw a big hole in the road and looked down. Will was at the bottom of the hole. There was a lot of water in the hole, and he must get out quickly because the hole was full of water. Patty tried to help him, but she didn't do. Because she needed somebody to help her to get out him, so she was going to get Mrs. Webb.
And Patty hit the door of the Seabird house, but Mr. Webb doesn't open the door because Mr. Webb isn't there, and he goes to London yesterday, and he is back tomorrow. And Patty asks Mrs. Barnes for help, and she can't reach him because Will fall into a hole. Will is very cold and his trousers are very wet. Later the rain and stream water come into the hole, and another part of the road fall into the hole, and Will put his hand over his hat. When Will is into the hole, he thinks something about the smugglers. Later, Will looks ahead at the top of the hole. The boy has very black hair and his eyes are brown and so big. And the boy gets down on the ground and he puts his arms to help Will. Later, Mrs. Burns and Patty reach to the hole and Will is out. And Will talk about the face of the feature, and Mrs. Barnes says the name of the feature is Dan Frenton, and Dan Frenton was died 100 years ago.
Chapter 6. A Smuggler's Story. Will had seen the Dan Fenton ghost. Patty couldn't believe it. Patty's face went white. Will told he saw through him. He saw the trees and right behind his face. They continued to talk with Mrs. Bourne about the George and Dan Fenton story. George Fenton was a smuggler, but his son didn't know. Then one night he followed his father down to the beach. He could watch to his father and some other men carry brandy from a boat. He got the brandy to the tunnel. The tunnel was under the cliff. Dan waited for 5 minutes and then he followed them. But the ground above the tunnel was very wet and heavy for rain. He walked for about 400 meters and then the ground fell in on top of him. So Dan did trapped underground. Next morning, George Fenton didn't find Dan. He went to look on the beach, but he couldn't find him. Then some other men looked in various parts of the village and along various parts of the cliffs and the beach. Then George remembered Dan's questions, and he knew Dan was in the tunnel, but it was impossible to get Dan here. Mrs. Dale came back the next morning. She said to them, "Gran is much better. Well, it's time to say goodbye."